With another video. This video is going to be analyzing Leeds versus Chelsea in the English Premier League. It's made using Keyframe. Great way to produce quality content, so if you want to check it out, the link's in the description below. Please like and subscribe to the channel. It's been a huge help. Thank you so much for everybody, and let's get right into it. So the first point is Chelsea changed up their system slightly. Not so much in possession really, but more in the defensive phase. But in possession, there was one key factor, and that was the asymmetry used in their first line of build-up, and then how they paired with Jorginho and Conte as a double pivot, but Conte playing a little bit higher, and that their pairing of playing a little bit off-center. So with the asymmetry, with Rudiger going much higher in the half space, usually in response to progression of the ball. So usually he would get the ball free and drive further forward, as we'll see in a few examples. And Jorginho, the holding midfielder on Rudiger's side, would then split the difference between Christensen and Rudiger to fill the gap, to allow better circulation and a better response in transition. Conte had more freedom to roam in the right-hand half space. He would play a little bit higher to start and then move into deeper positions oftentimes to then create press-resistant structures against a Leeds man-oriented press. And then Leeds, not too much to change with them. In recent times, they played a man-oriented defense, which often had the wide players, the wingers, play a bit more narrow to press from out to in on the Chelsea central defenders, and have players like Luke Ayling and the right fullback pressing the wide players from Chelsea. Sometimes in the second half, that would be Reece James as the wingback, and then the midfielders pushing up against the Chelsea double pivot. And to make up for the numerical advantage that Chelsea had, they'd often use cover shadows, and in this match sometimes they used it slightly different than they usually had in the past. But we can look further at the Chelsea build-up shape and what we mean by the relationship between Jorginho and Conte and the back three in the build-up phase, with Rudiger on the left-hand side, Azpilicueta as the right center back, and now we have the staggering from Conte and Jorginho. And this is one blindside movement from Conte, with Dallas jumping to press Azpilicueta, the center defender, which allows Conte the opportunity to then move into the blind side of Dallas and receive the pass in the half space, with his momentum taking him forward, with a player like Rodrigo on the wrong side of him in terms of a man-oriented defense, giving Conte the advantage. And then we also see how Leeds have a numerical disadvantage in the attacking third when they're pressing, but they make up for it with dual roles, especially on the weak side. The weak side player usually always has a dual role, because the time it will take the pass to get there will often be sufficient for the player to adequately press either. But with the blindside movement and the versatility in Conte in the half space, allowed Chelsea to often circulate and use a third man movement to escape pressure. And now with Mendy in goal, he was used sparingly, but Christensen usually dropped to Mendy's right, with Azpilicueta then creating a little bit of asymmetry again. Jorginho splitting the difference between Christensen and Rudiger, creating almost a central triangle in a press-resistant structure, with in the second half, when Rodrigo came off, Clickwood went on to then occupy the pivot to prevent any progression through the central area. Tyler Roberts then was tasked with pressing the two most central defenders and using a numerical disadvantage here. Rodrigo jumping on to create access to Azpilicueta, which will then force Chelsea a bit wider. But with Chelsea's shape, and as we see, we've talked about Conte before, Conte's positioning in this area, he has then moved higher, freeing up this space for then giving him the time to move back into it, and the timing is key. So as we see, Conte moves back into it, but with the angle of the pass, it's not a good situation because of just the diagonal aspect of this and where Conte's body positioning is, and the timing of the action doesn't elicit a strong third man concept. So the response would then be to the man-oriented press of Leeds, to then skip the press as the mutual help space connections, as we can call it, aren't strong enough or they aren't available. So this would often be seen as a situation to then skip the press by Chelsea and look for the third line pass. And as we see, man orientation all over the field from Leeds, central defender jumping with Timo Werner, Conte being man marked, click on the holding midfielder, Alioski creating access to Reece James, and we can just see this all over the field really quickly. So these third line passes would need to be supported through dynamic movement underneath to then progress further forward, but the intensity was at times very hard for Chelsea to escape and deal with. Then now we see another build-up sequence in the midfield third now, and the asymmetry provided by Rudiger, and his distance between the other two defenders was often the longest, and because that's based on the support of Jorginho playing the blind side of the forward, and this would then either allow Rudiger to progress the ball himself through the half space via dribbling, and Jorginho would be there to then fill in for circulation and transition as we talked about, or in this situation with the press coming, it would then allow Jorginho to then move into the blind side to then receive a third man pass and springboard the attack further forward, with players like Kai Havertz and Ziyech playing further forward up the field. By Jorginho occupying a deeper role, it creates more space through the half space for the two furthest players forward, Ziyech and Havertz, to then look to occupy this space and move deeper into it and receive the pass with a little bit space and in a tighter area to compress the lead shape to then access space created elsewhere. And we see from Leeds, with the two advanced players from Chelsea, Leeds are playing a little bit man-oriented with a makeshift back five, oftentimes with Phillips dropping in with Ziyech, as we see here, just to create their free man and the most central defender as seen in this picture. So now, even in the initial phase of build-up, when Mendy was being used, we still see the asymmetry involved and the off-centeredness from Conte and Jorginho. Jorginho playing most centrally, and this allows for players like Mason Mount, Kai Havertz, to then drop into this half space in the blind side of the press and try and escape further forward. But with tight man marking, they need support underneath them unless they use qualitative advantage to then progress further forward. We see Ben Chilwell, when he was in, he played slightly deeper initially in this build-up phase to create a stronger circulation and give more options across the field. And this affected Rodrigo as Leeds press looked to take advantage of their dual roles, and then the midfield was man-marked, as we see here with Dallas and Tyler Roberts, and then another situation of the cover shadow on the weak side, so giving Rodrigo just the 1v1 and pressing situation with Ben Chilwell. So here, with Leeds in possession of the ball, the main key was Ayling in the first line of build-up, and his positioning could be a deep fullback, creating a back three in possession of the ball with Stuart Dallas or Calvin Phillips as the holding midfielder, which allowed them to have either a 3-2 build-up shape, but oftentimes the lone pivot with movement from players further forward moving into wide areas to draw the Chelsea players in out of dangerous spaces to then allow the players from Leeds to access these spaces. And from Chelsea, late in the game, they switched to what looked like a 5-3-2 with Jorginho behind Conte and Mount. But starting off the game, it looked more of a 4-4-2, so a little bit of a situational change, and Leeds, with their rotations often centered around the wide areas, made it a little bit difficult to define their structure at times. So, as we see here with Luke Ayling, and now Calvin Phillips being the lone pivot, as we said, Stuart Dallas playing more of an 8 through a little box-to-box, and then Tyler Roberts playing closer to the forward highest line of attack with the players from Chelsea in the first line, looking to overcome a 4 versus 2 situation with players like Conte and Mason Mount jumping on to then support the press and cover the 2 players in the first line of pressure. But another situation from Leeds was often defined by their wide area structures, as we mentioned before. So with Ayling on the ball deeper in the half space, we have Phillips, Dallas, and their wide player through the half space, creating a 4 versus 2. But when the situation occurred, oftentimes when these Leeds players were drawn deeper towards the ball, as they are here, as we see, the Leeds players are deeper. This often elicited a more direct pass in behind for a forward running on the outside shoulder of the central defender. Now Leeds again in their first phase of build-up with Melier splitting the 2 central defenders. Both Luke Ayling and Alioski, the number 10, were quite deep to pull out the wide players from Chelsea to then create space through the half spaces, and Phillips moving in the blind spot of the defenders, which was a big trend for him, either to receive the pass himself or moving the blind spot to receive a third line pass going back. And we see then the 5-3-2 situation with Werner and Callum Hudson-Odoi coming on as subs late in the game. So then, with Leeds playing very direct and Click coming on, playing through the central corridor oftentimes, their direct pass wasn't that ineffective in the sense they had the players around the ball where the ball would land to then make an effective second ball and transition situation, but sometimes they didn't structure themselves quite well enough to take advantage of these numerical advantages around the ball in response to going direct, especially late in the game, but the situations were there, and when these players aren't quite structured the spacing that's required, it creates the advantage for then Chelsea if they can break the press to then have numbers further forward, as we see here, to then springboard their attack in a transition moment. So the last picture now for Leeds is again them building out of the back with deep fullbacks, this time using a 4-man back line with Alioski and Luke Ayling as the wide fullbacks, and then by them playing deeper, pulls out the Chelsea press, and the wide players forces them to go further up the field in a higher position, which would then allow players like Calvin Phillips or Stuart Dallas or Tyler Roberts to access the half space as we've seen in the past. But here, with Mason Mount being dragged out, created the potential for Calvin Phillips to then access the half space through a blindside movement to then springboard their attack further forward. So just a quick analysis today, guys. Thanks everyone for joining me. Please like and subscribe to the channel. That would be a huge help, and I'll see you in the next one.